Morning, everyone. I'm reading from Psalm 23, the New Living Translation. The Lord is my shepherd, I have all that I need. He lets me rest in green meadows. He leads me beside peaceful streams. He renews my strength. He guides me along right paths, bringing honor to his name. Even when I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff protect and comfort me. You prepare a feast for me in the presence of my enemies. You honor me by anointing my head with oil. My cup overflows with blessings. Surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will live in the house of the Lord forever.
Good morning, church. Am I okay on this one, Andy? Is that all right? All right. Before we get started, will you pray with me? God, as we come together in this space to reflect on your word, to think about what we believe, I pray that you would be with each one of us. God, if there are difficult things in this, then I pray you would make each of us feel safe. May we feel confident in your love for us. God, may we also be ready to listen to what you have to say. God, I pray that my words may fall away, but that your words for each of us will take root in our hearts. Amen. So good morning, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name is Nathan Palmer. I'm part of the leadership team here at Oasis Waterloo, and I have the privilege of facilitating our pastoral care cluster, which is probably why I'm here to talk to you today. Over the course of the next 2 weeks, we're going to have a little two-part series. I did wonder whether we can still call it a series. Is it more of a dyad? I'm not entirely sure. But anyway, we're going to have a little time to look at this idea of pastoral care and what that means. Hopefully some of you will have heard us mention this topic on a couple of previous occasions, as it's something we want to put more emphasis on as a church. So what we'd like to do is take this time to really explore together what we mean and also what we don't mean when we talk about pastoral care, and to really think about what does that mean in our context. What does it mean for Oasis Waterloo? And really start a conversation together about how we can develop the pastoral side to our ministry and how that can help us to grow as a community of faith. So the first thing I'd like you to do is just take a minute before I get started to think about what do those two words mean for you. So I've said pastoral care a number of times. So what I want you to think about is, what does that conjure up? Think about ideas, perhaps think about images. What do you see in your mind? Perhaps think about stories or history. Because what I'd encourage you to think about is, therefore, what's your kind of lens on this? What informs your perspective on it? And also, where might we be carrying a little bit of baggage? Just sit with that for a second. Because for some of us, it might be that this is a fairly neutral phrase. We might not have many links at all with it. It might not be something that we come across in our day-to-day lives, and therefore perhaps we haven't got a lot of storytelling that goes on in our minds when we hear that phrase. For others, it may be about spaces beyond church. So increasingly, we see the phrase being used particularly in education, so in schools, in universities, in areas like that, but also in other contexts like hospitals and workplaces. We might talk about pastorally supporting people. It also may have, for many of us, much more of a kind of churchy meaning. there was a little bit of me which thought this was an example of what we call Christianese, but I think we have to recognize that actually it has a much bigger life outside of that now. But it may be that you think about organising visits to the sick, or the elderly or the lonely, or something Lily and I talk about a lot is that this was the phrase that meant a dog collar was required. If we talked about pastoral care, then what we meant was, who needs a visit from the pastor? Whether that was about bringing communion wafers, oil, absolution, or a telling off sometimes could be associated with this. Some of those images might resonate with you, none of them might resonate with you. But what I'd encourage you to think about is what's the lens and the potential baggage you might bring to that, and how does that inform your view? The reason I say that is because while I facilitate our pastoral care cluster, for me it is very much a thing that I am ambivalent about. On the one hand, it is something which I believe is so important and so vital to the being of church that we have to engage with it and look at how we use it to invest in our community. But in the other hand, it sits with my baggage around some of the practices in the church which can be used to harm others and which have been used to cause problems. So the first thing we did as a pastoral care cluster was therefore look at how do we define this and what does it mean for us, both through discussion by talking about it and having some of those open conversations around how do we grapple with that, but also through action by doing things and finding out what works for us. So the definition that we came to centers around these ideas. So for us, pastoral care is about providing holistic care for the practical, emotional, and spiritual needs of our church community here at Oasis Waterloo, and making sure that nobody gets missed. And I want to take a minute just to unpack a couple of the phrases there. So the first thing is, when we talk about holistic care, the reason that's important for us is that we feel we need to recognize that each of us have a whole range of different needs, and that it's not possible to kind of separate spiritual care from all the other things that are really important to us. So we've been looking at the letter of James over the course of the last couple of weeks, and really it's building on that idea. So in James it talks about what good is it to see one of our siblings who's hungry or cold and say, be warm and well fed, but do nothing about it. And I think what that book is talking to us there is that actually we can't create this false separation between physical, spiritual, emotional, and those things, because as human beings, that's just not how we work. We can't say as the church, we're here for your spiritual needs, but for everything else, you're on your own. Because as people, that's just not true to our experience. So I think if you look at Jesus' ministry, we see that same blend, right? So Jesus was a lot about teaching, he shared lots of good ideas, but he also healed people, he ministered to people in that way, and everything was done in community, with food. The one thing we know Jesus did a lot was eat, right? If we look at those stories. So he lived with people in the midst of their everyday life and ministered to them in this holistic way. I think that is the first thing we want to bring to this, that this isn't about how we just provide spiritual care for each other. It is about recognizing the reality of that need to bring things together. Secondly, this idea that nobody gets missed is what sits at the heart of our strategy in this area. So we recognize that as a church community, we face a kind of unique context. So we are a city-centered church. Lots of people come from all over the place to join us, lots facing very long journeys. We each, in the reality of our modern lives, are quite busy, and therefore, what I'm always amazed by is every time I get the privilege of standing out the front here, I see new faces that I haven't seen before. And that's a wonderful thing, but it also means that it can be difficult for us to create good connections with each other. and to know what's the difference between we haven't seen so-and-so for a few weeks because they're really busy versus we haven't seen so-and-so for a few weeks, there's something they need our help with. Now, we haven't got that nailed yet, 100%. I would say if Nath Jones and I talk about anything most regularly, it's probably that. But we are trying to engage with that and look at how we solve that together. And in the 21st century, what does that mean? It's something we want to tackle really mindfully so that as we grow together, everyone knows they're counted in. And everyone knows that therefore they are important to us in the same way they are important to God. That's why we have our messy O of inclusion behind us, to recognize that that's what community is in all of its messiness. And the third thing I just want to think about is the why. So we want to provide that holistic care. We want to make sure nobody gets missed. And I think that's because collectively we want to work towards our goal. And I really like this 2nd century quote. So Irenaeus of Lyon said, "The glory of God is a human person fully alive," which is just an unpacking of those words that Rebecca shared with us at the start of the service from Colossians about having life in all its fullness. So for me, us providing good care for each other is not just about what some of us might have thought about as the idea of salvation, right? It's not just about trying to get everybody to secure their ticket to heaven. It is about how do we ensure we have the best life we can now. And for reasons I'll come on to later, I believe that's something we do together, not something that we do individually. So that's the kind of context for me. That's what we mean by pastoral care. That's what we mean at Oasis. So my job this week is to think about how is that grounded in theology for us. So how is that grounded in our understanding of what following the way of Jesus means? And then how has that been lived out at different times? So there are 3 ideas I would like to talk about with you. So that's about how we each play our part in this, how pastoral care is about bringing God to the fore, and lastly, how that helps us to build our community. So first of all, if we think about this idea of playing our part, I really strongly believe that each of us has a role to play in pastoral care. Each of us has a role to play in caring for each other. Now, I say this while simultaneously wanting to communicate very strongly that we value very highly those people amongst us who have had formal ministry training. We are very grateful for Nathan and Rebecca, for everything Steve has done for us as well. But I want to put this in the broader context of actually, I think one of the things which can frame our lens in this space is the historical legacy of the church. That a lot of emphasis has always been placed on ordained ministers, effectively, in lots of Christian traditions. And that there's lots of interpretations and ways of looking at the Bible which kind of really underpin that. So if you think about how we read the story of Jesus renaming Peter and saying, "You will be the rock on which I build my church," that over time that has been interpreted as meaning Peter was the first pope in some traditions, and therefore you've got this line of succession going all the way down where important men, and I use that word deliberately, are therefore the people who we look to and who are the people who can provide the best support for us and all those kinds of things. Now, we haven't got the time today to explore all of the theology around this. I don't want to go down a huge rabbit hole. But what I will say is that personally, I'm a much stronger believer in the priesthood of all believers. That actually we all play a part in building God's house or in building God's kingdom together. And in this spirit, there's lots of verses in the New Testament which talk to us about that talk to us about the role we can play. So we are called to demonstrate our love for one another. We're called to bear one another's burdens together. We are called to encourage one another. This verse in Romans 12 kind of brings it all together. So it talks about if your gift is to encourage others, be encouraging. If it is giving, give generously. And if you have a gift for showing kindness to others, do it gladly. For me, that brings together lots of the things that we can do for each of us to play our part and show that care for each other. At the same time, I do want to acknowledge that there are limits, there are boundaries. Each of us should be mindful not to take on too much. So as we support each other, we absolutely recognize that there are roles for those who have professional training, where we work in partnership with other organizations outside the church, but also where some of us are better equipped to deal with certain issues, right? So I'm not saying we all need to be each other's therapists, but what I'm saying is what Romans offers us is this lens of saying, what is our gift in caring for each other, and how can we do that to the best of our ability? That is about demonstrating love to each other, I think, which is what we are talking about in this space. If we think about practically what that means, I think that can just be about noticing things. As I alluded to earlier, who haven't we seen for a while? Who do you think might benefit from a chat or some practical support? Each of us can ask that question about whether somebody needs some more help. And then there are people who are on hand to help with that. So on a practical level, I think this really helps us to understand why it's important each of us looks for what is our part in this. So I'd encourage you after today to think about what's the gift that you bring to this, and what do you think is your role in establishing that pastoral care in our community. The second idea I want us to think about is the idea that caring for each other is how we can bring God to the fore in the reality of everyday life. I think pastoral care is about how we help each other to do that in a really practical way. So the word pastor comes from the word pastoral comes from the Latin word for shepherd. So that's why an alternative meaning of the word pastoral is if you think about the pastoral symphony, then it's about idyllic rural scenes, right? If you talk about that word, then you're kind of picturing scenes like the one behind me. This one is probably missing a few sheep, to be fair, for it to be really pastoral, but it hopefully gives you a bit of the context. That's why I chose today's reading. So today's reading, Psalm 23, I think is the most beautiful expansion of this metaphor in the Bible. God as the shepherd who journeys with us throughout our whole journey, whether that's about resting in those green meadows or about whether that's traveling through the dark valley. And I think where we support each other in that is that when we have those dark moments can be when it is most difficult to find God in the everyday. It can be hard when we're in the middle of those experiences to feel like God's kingdom is near. But together, I think we can remind each other that God's big story is made up of each of our little stories. For me, that's one of the key things that comes out of the Bible, is it's such a collection of both massive, important historical stories, but also just tiny everyday stories of people's lives. And in the same way, that's what makes up the kingdom today. And that our dark days are just as much a part of that as our good days. I believe we can reassure each other through that by what we call the ministry of presence, which is just a really posh way of saying just being there, right? Or in 21st century language, we might talk about holding space. But all of those things mean exactly the same thing, right? As human beings, being with each other, being in relationship, taking the time to sit with somebody is so important and such a part, I believe, of our sense of care and of ministering to each other. But it's also not just about the dark times. So in the Anglican tradition, they talk about the pastoral offices, and that includes a whole range of things. So it includes confirmation, marriage, dedication, reconciliation. It includes things like care for the sick and dying and burial as well. But basically, each of these kind of moments in our lives, these kind of milestones, these transitional points, are moments of pastoral care. And that really got me thinking, because it's actually showing that caring for each other is about bringing God into all of those moments, right? Not just the bad times, but actually all of those things. Jill talked last year to us about trying to identify what are those transitional moments for us in today's context. If we can let go of some of the kind of heteronormativity of that list of events I just gave you, what does that look like today? In our community, what does that look like? You know, we've had the privilege to journey with people as they've gone on adoption journeys. We've had the privilege of journeying together as people have been through difficult things like redundancy. We journey together through career milestones like the publishing of books. All of those things are important moments in our lives where, living as a faith community, we bring God into those moments. That when we say, well done, that's amazing. That when we say, tell us about how you did that. That when we celebrate together, what we do is bring God into that story. We bring that into the tapestry of our lives together. And in doing so, we show care for each other. I would be a very poor pastoral care person if I only cared about you when you were crying, right? So how do I demonstrate that actually we hold that same care all the time? There's some traditional views that pastoral care is about the church's response to suffering, but I genuinely believe it's so much more than that. It's about how we show up for each other in all the seasons of life, how we bring God into each of those moments. So again, I'd encourage you to think about, how do you do that for the people you're in relationship with? How do we bring God into those reactions? And also, how do we mark those steps on the journey? Again, that's something we want to have an ongoing discussion about, is what does that look like as a church? And how do we show that we value that journey together? And the last thing I want to talk to you about is about how this helps us to build our community. Because what I want us to do is try and zoom out from thinking about this as an individual way to thinking about how it helps us as a community, how it helps us together. Because I think one of the dangers here is that our default is to kind of take a quite westernized view of this, right? Which is that we picture care as like a helicopter thing, like somebody's in trouble, so we helicopter in and we give them some support, and then they're fine, so we go out again and we go on to the next person. It's like SOS. It could be a Channel 5 series, and my parents would watch it. But in reality, the reason we do that, we can think about in such a more rich way, that actually when we care for each other, both of us benefit. That when we care for each other as a community, all of us benefit. We talked before about the idea of Ubuntu, which I know some of you are familiar with, but this idea that I am because we are. So if we invest in each other, if we invest in our community, if we care for somebody today, knowing that we exist in a reciprocal community where those network bonds are strengthened, then actually we are all better off. Lots of you know I work as a psychologist, and this is one of the key things we often are trying to help people unlock, is to not see themselves as on their own, but to recognize the resources they have around them and what can they do to strengthen them. We have a lot of conversations about how do we bring that back into our conversations, that actually as community we are stronger. It's a massive part of our mission as Oasis to show what does that look like in real life and how do we make it practical. And as a church, I believe we have a responsibility to be one of those really strong examples, to show that actually the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that as we show that care for each other, we will see that happen. Just to take two of the ways we can think about that. So one is, if we look at lots of the examples where Jesus healed people, the first step might be that physical healing. The second step was that was reconciling them back into the community. What he actually gave lots of those people was a ticket back into the wholeness of being with other people. So that if their illness had been something which meant they were shut out, that meant they were the outsider, the result of the healing was to bring them back in, to make them feel part of the fold again, and therefore gain all of that strength. And when the early church comes together, there's this really fascinating phrase in Acts, which I love, which says, all the believers were together and had everything in common. Now, in the way we mean they had everything in common, I'm willing to bet quite a lot they didn't have everything in common, right? But it brings again this idea that there is this interconnectedness there, that actually as a community they were enmeshed perhaps in each other's lives in a way that it was about the strength of the community, building each other up, and not about a kind of atomized, individualistic view. I think that can be really hard to grasp in our cultural context, and I really challenge myself all the time to try and open my mind to think about it differently, to learn from the cultures which do this so much better than is part of my British heritage. But ultimately, I do know that the only places where I have really experienced this is in church. And here being an example of that. And my prayer would be that as we go on this journey together, that each of us would be able to say that. Would be able to say that the strength of community is something we experience here. Not just in this physical space, but in the real sense of our relationships with each other. So I'd encourage each of us to think about what those things mean for us. So first of all, what does playing your part look like when we think about offering care to each other? How can we be a part of that provision of pastoral care? Secondly, what pastoral needs do we see? How can we share those? If you are thinking of something, if it's raised questions for you, then please do come and find any of us on the pastoral team or the leadership team. We'd be super happy to talk to you about it. But also, next week, the format of our service is going to be more of a panel. So what I'd like you to do is, if you've got ideas or you've got questions, we will release during the week a way of gathering those questions. So please do share those with us, and the panel will talk about those next week. But also, if there's anything, do come and talk to one of us, and we will feed that in as well. Ultimately, when it comes to our theology of pastoral care, having talked about lots of different things, I just want to leave you with this final thing. Because I think for me, it all comes down to this. Jesus said, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." I feel like I could have just said that and sat down. Some of you may wish I had, but I hope that on the way, there's been some good things for us all to think about. Amen.
Thanks so much, Nath. Lots for us to take from that this morning and to carry into our weeks and months ahead.